The lecture you're about to hear is entitled Balance. It is part of a series of discussions with Richard Kinninger entitled On Becoming an Initiate.
The philosophy which made the Lemurian civilization so great was based upon the maintenance of balance in all aspects of human life. Every person who has ever become an initiate in any of the 7 lesser brotherhoods has had to acquire personal balance between 3 major aspects of his or her egoic development: mentality, practicality, and ideality. The traditional symbol of the initiate is the equilateral triangle, of which each side represents one of these 3 characteristics of human nature. Occult literature has referred to these all-important components of balance as the 3 kings. About 11,000 years ago, 3 major cultures were coexistent on Earth, and each was particularly representative of one of the 3 sides of the triangle. Ancient Egypt was characterized by excessive emphasis upon development of mind power. Atlantis was almost exclusively devoted to practicality, and its culture emphasized utility and efficiency to the detriment of beauty and artistry. The Rama Empire in India was steeped in spirituality and idealism, which led its citizens to hold work in contempt. The extremism of their respective outlooks on the nature of existence and human values kept these 3 cultures each from being tolerant of the other 2, and indeed, historically, there was great friction between them. Undoubtedly, these cultures provided an opportunity for egos to obtain concentrated experience for the enhancement of whatever side of their nature was underdeveloped. Yet the one-sidedness within each of these countries held back their citizens from attaining initiation due to the powerful influence which environment has upon persons growing up in a given culture. It was because of this very imbalance that these 3 centers of civilization failed to grow to the stature of Lemuria. In fact, their progressive divergence over the centuries, through exclusive emphasis on their own particular view, eventually led to the downfall of each by way of internal instability. Those of you with an interest in Masonic and biblical symbolism will recognize that the conflict and interplay between King Solomon, representing idealism, King Hiram, representing practicality, and the Queen of Sheba, representing mentality, during the building of the Temple of Jerusalem, representing egoic development, pointed up how important balanced expression of these 3 aspects of human nature are to the successful accomplishment of worthy ends. What was the origin of these different ways of looking at life and dealing with the world? Innocently enough, it began with the fact that women's biological role is different from men's. In primitive times, as male egos began incarnating into men's bodies and female egos began incarnating into women's bodies, the nurturant, docile nature of women was comparatively a strong determinant in her daily existence, whereas a man was rather exclusively motivated by his natural aggressiveness and built-in protectiveness towards his dependents and what he owned. A woman's life in that prehistoric era centered primarily around her bearing and rearing children. The long period of human babies' helplessness fostered the development of intuitional thinking in females to help mothers perceive their offspring's needs. A woman was more dependent upon her mate to bring food, while she concentrated on taking care of her brood. Moreover, young unmated females accompanied males on the hunt for food and were well aware of the dangers posed by wild animals. When she was no longer able to travel freely because of pregnancy or her youngsters, she stayed at a base camp with other mothers and tended to concern herself with her mate's safety and to imagine where he was and try to sense what kinds of dangers he might be encountering. Male and female egos started out with exactly the same capacities and powers of mind, but females developed the intuitional aspects of mind way ahead of males. The man, on the other hand, became more practical in his concerns. He had to learn to track and kill animals, and he had to protect his family from predatory males who would seek to take his women by force. Cunning, courage, skill, and sheer brawn were necessary for his having what he wanted. So-called masculine and feminine traits slowly evolved over millennia and differentiated the outlook of the 2 sexes. In those parts of the world where agriculture and animal husbandry developed, the hunter became relatively unimportant to the needs of his people, and his dominance declined so that the maternal, nurturant aspects of the women rose to a comparatively more prominent role in the life of the tribe. Where people remained dependent on hunting for survival, the masculine, aggressive outlook predominated in the tribe. Thus arose the matriarchal and patriarchal ways of life in various parts of the globe and at different times in man's history. The special guidance given by angels to the budding Lemurian civilization, and later by Melchizedek's 1,000-year reign, established the format for developing a balance between patriarchal and matriarchal strengths. The different emphases developed by male and female egos in their sex role experiences up to that time began to merge in early Lemuria. As centuries passed, men and women in Lemuria each acquired the better aspects of masculinity and femininity for themselves, while eliminating the less desirable traits associated with male and female personality differences. The process of continuously working to grow in this way concurrently strengthened both sexes' powers of mind, and their mentality grew apace along with practicality and ideality. Then began many persons' breakthroughs to natural clairvoyance, which was less fraught with spiritual danger in those days before the advent of black mentalists. The Lemurian men and women advanced rapidly toward what we today call mastership, since cynicism and sophistication did not yet undermine man's faith in what he could achieve. It is necessary that personal, egoic Lemurian balance be re-established in you if you hope to achieve initiation in a brotherhood. Our civilization must do everything possible to enhance the acquisition of individuals' egoic balance by re-establishing a culture which allows children to naturally absorb every aspect of balance from the pervading culture and its world outlook. Men and women today who turn their feet upon the path to egoic perfection have to spend 20 years of their lives overcoming the negative attitude-forming influences of their first 20 years so they can finally start out at neutral in their 40s. What an incredible waste of time, happiness, efficiency, and cultural advancement. Moreover, we are all permanently scarred by the ignorance of those who tried to rear us the best they could without full knowledge of universal law, psychology, or awareness of the purpose of life and how to fulfill it. We instead must synthesize and put together the aspects of the matriarchal and patriarchal views of the world so as to regain the potent Lemurian philosophy of balance. This involves our taking into account all things and assigning to them proper values in our quest for egoic growth and for control of our environment. Philosophies of life other than the Lemurian are usually constructed around one of two main streams of thought. These two contrasting views are variously referred to as the rational versus the cosmic, Western versus Eastern, Apollonian versus Dionysian, free versus Catholic, and patriarchal versus matriarchal. The adherents of each of these two views traditionally regard them as mutually incompatible, and two divergent camps have thus arisen. Either view, when carried to the extreme, produces end results which are proof to its opponents of the very real horrors lurking in the other system, so they vigorously cast out any part of the opposite view from their own philosophy. But both views are equal halves of what is correct, and both are essential to human balance. The genuine searcher for truth must take both views into account and find the path to sanity and reality. There are brilliantly intelligent men who are firm adherents of the scientific method, and yet they also deeply believe in God. There are different forms of thinking, all valid, which are available to us for perceiving reality in its many forms. Indeed, the two hemispheres of each person's cerebral cortex divide the cortex into two functions. The left side specializes in reason, logic, analysis, and language, whereas the right side specializes in intuition, imagination, spatial relationships, and holistic synthesis. The concrete and the abstract can be simultaneously real in an individual's experiences, just as can the practical and the artistic, the rational and the fantastic, and physical and spiritual percepts. For a person to be a whole human being, he must touch upon the whole universe. His brain and body are creating tools, but they are also sensitive receivers of all the messages streaming from the far corners of creation, as well as from life near at hand. Certainly we must look to outer space for information, but perception of your own body's inner space will reveal great wonders to you also. Let us compare the Apollonian and Dionysian views. These names, incidentally, are derived from two gods of the Greek pantheon, Apollo, the god of reason, order, light, and boundaries, and Dionysus, the god of wine, excess, fantasy, and metamorphosis. It may be divisive to describe the opposing values of two different world views and line them up into two camps, yet analysis is valuable to see the patterns and tendencies of our own ideas. Remember, however, that the elements of both views are right, and the sage incorporates both views concurrently within himself. The two views were never meant to be separated. Practical and idealistic attributes, when blended into a balanced whole, along with mentality, are the stuff of which initiates are made. The history of a people, the nature of their natural environment, and their mode of competition with others all influence their philosophy and mythology, and vice versa. Patriarchal Greek influence on Christian thought emphasized separation of God from the world, man's spirit from the flesh, and mind from matter. Higher value was placed on spirit and mind as sacred Apollonian aspects of man, which were at odds with his bodily needs. Patriarchal man, therefore, is seen as divided within himself, separated from God by sin, and in contention with nature which threatens to overwhelm him. The rationalist regards the universe as a chaos of random physical forces held in check by one another. His human society is formed by a social contract to control man's natural aggression and territorial instincts, which otherwise would tend toward total warfare. On the other hand, the matriarchal philosophies see unity in human mind and body, and God exists in every aspect of his creation. Unity underlies the appearances of plurality, continuity exists between all life forms, and the whole cosmos is an integration of intelligent life in graduated planes. The universe is order, and things occur in it by intelligent design. The matriarchal community is a single organic whole, and the various functions of social structure are a harmonious outworking of the fulfilling of man's needs. Western man sees himself as an intelligent force bringing rationality and order to the world. He molds his environment and exploits it for his own purposes. He makes valuable and useful objects out of raw matter, and he finds dignity in work, seriousness, realism, intellectualism, devising good laws, and imposing boundaries that keep disorder from overwhelming the culture. Eastern man regards himself as but another cog in the great wheel of life. His individuality is apparent, but he is merged like a drop in the cosmic ocean of life. Every entity is a manifestation of the free play of a single divine substance. Man is supposed to partake of and enjoy the caprices of life. Work is but a matter of necessity. Human dignity resides in humor, fantasy, love, play, and spontaneity. Western man glorifies a strong, aggressive, disciplined ego. Being able to cope is the highest ideal. To force the body and the emotions under the total control of reason is a lifelong aim. Although he believes a mature person should be able to work and love, responsibility comes before love. The ambiguities between science and faith are seen as a perpetual tragic conflict, but for him to seek a life without conflict is unrealistic and a flight from responsibility. Strong central government is his political ideal. Eastern man shies from egocentricity. He tries to purge his head of calculation and instead allow instinct and compassion to govern him. Wondering awe and childlike innocence is his way to stay in touch with God. Aggressiveness is vanity. To force one's head to dominate the body is to subvert one's creative powers and to spawn insanity. Pure democracy is his political ideal. In traditional Western medicine, the physician acts as an objective professional expert who takes charge and intervenes with chemicals or surgery. In the East, the therapist acts more like a guide with loving empathy than as a scientist. He searches for sources of imbalance, and emphasis is placed on allowing the organism to naturally achieve a state of harmony between mind, body, and cosmos. Intervention is minimal. Therapies are designed to diminish the head's busy dominance and thereby return the center of being to the body. Apollonian thinking flourishes in male-dominated, pyramidally structured societies where masculine traits, practicality, rationality, aggressiveness, authoritarianism permeate the culture. Dionysian thinking is native to matriarchal societies and planting cultures where the cycle of the seasons and the dependency on Mother Nature is the basis of existence. The feminine virtues of surrender, trust, and nurturance are regarded highly. Within an Apollonian culture, any activity which depends upon surrender of personal control is resisted. Play, leisure, mysticism, ESP, poetry, and fantasy tend to be repressed because they are threatening to the work ethic. Such cultures usually make their citizens ashamed to experience ecstasy in the sublime. They find it difficult to see the humor of life. Apollonians must always be doing and making and changing things. They have a hard time just being and enjoying. The romantic imagination of Dionysians makes it difficult for them to work, to decide, to recognize the value of conflict and anger, to be efficient, and to deal with the realities of evil and suffering. It is difficult for them to use power, plan social change, and work within institutions. They find it easier to flow along and to immerse themselves in emotions, fantasy, and mysticism. It seems unnatural to them to make commitments, accept discipline, recognize limits, and become responsible, individuated persons. The people who live out their lives exclusively in accordance with just one of these two world views are severely crippled by their one-sidedness. Moreover, they are dangerous, since both views tend towards fanaticism when separated from the counterbalancing of the other view. Unfortunately, this imbalance applies to almost everyone on the planet. It is important for Americans to understand that their cultural preferences are the result of their having been a part of the patriarchal Western civilization. Several centuries ago, Europeans were agrarian people who worked closely with the land and were in tune with the diurnal impulses of nature. We turned from that maternal, life-giving emphasis of nature consciousness to materialism and ownership. This was brought about by the rise of the merchant middle class, followed by the Industrial Revolution. Emphasis on boundaries and acquisition promoted separateness and covetousness. The masculine, militaristic, and patriarchal traditions of Western society came to the fore to organize and channel human energy into disciplined nationalism. Stell's closely integrated economy is designed to play down individual ownership and acquisitiveness in order to encourage restoration of a balance between practicality and ideality. There is a basic human appetite to devote oneself to a worthy effort transcending self-indulgence. Many satisfactions are derived from working for the common good of many other people and coincidentally helping to build something greater than oneself with which one can identify. The private enterprise profit motive is still alive, but it has been acquiring a conscience. Stell is at the forefront of a larger trend for business corporations to become benign and less exploitive. People willingly serve within a large organization to effectively accomplish mutual goals without personal monetary reward or acquisition of power being their prime spurs to putting forth effort. This has been proven again in Stell as well as in many other organizations. If a person does not share the American immigrant's hunger for ownership of real estate, he is not driven to exhaust himself gathering possessions and fighting to get to the top income brackets. He can then feel free to cooperate rather than compete with his fellows, and the whole basic attitude of what is important to him begins to change. Efficiency and ecstasy are both important in their related spheres of activity. Learning to combine them in a balanced mix is a task of the next few generations. The nation of God must be comprised of such men and women who are living the whole human experience. The Hermetic Brotherhood, which was responsible for the design of the Great Pyramid of Giza built 6,700 years ago, was used as the agency for reintroducing technology into the world. The mystery taught by the Hermetics is precision, and scientific technology and engineering are closely tied to the disciplines of mathematics in which this brotherhood specializes. They carried out their plan through two Semitic peoples, to each of whom the brotherhood gave us philosophy, religious cohesiveness, and a name. These were the Minoans on the island of Crete and the Jews. The people who eventually became known by these names were selected for the Hermetics program because they were feisty nomads who had few ties to the earth religions of that period and were unusually aggressive raiders. They were unlike the whole rest of that part of the world, which then consisted of matriarchal planting cultures. The Hyksos came from the region east of present-day Turkey, and over a period of a century they gradually migrated into Egypt. This was their first of two invasions, the second being 3,000 years later and much less peaceful. A few members of their race, who were subsequently born in Egypt, gradually took over the administration of the country and prepared the way for construction of the Great Pyramid. When its construction was completed, these people disappeared from Egypt as mysteriously as they entered it. From Egypt they migrated to Crete and eventually became known as the Minoans, then the only seafaring people of the Mediterranean area. When the volcanic island of Santorin, north of Crete, exploded some 3,300 years later and made Crete uninhabitable, the Minoans dispersed to several of their close-knit colonies in Greece, Phoenicia, or Philistia, Carthage, Etruria, and Wales. Their introduction en masse into the matriarchal culture of the Carians in Greece created a cultural upheaval that was intended by the Hermetic Brotherhood, which incidentally set up headquarters in Greece at that time. The Carians had close bonds with Mother Earth, her seasonal rhythms, the Demeter mystery — Demeter is the Greek goddess of agriculture — and maternity. In a matriarchal culture, there is abandonment to natural drives, peaceful pleasure, and infantilism lasting unto old age. Unconditional love, unconscious lawfulness, emphasis on bonds of blood and soil, compassion and mercy, equality, and natural communal democracy are all elements of the unrestrained, undisciplined way of the earth religions. Matriarchy is characteristic of the Dionysian worldview. The Hermetics carefully evolved patriarchal attitudes in the masculine, aggressive, courageous, bull-worshipping Minoans. The new Minoan influence in Greece called to the Carians to strive towards spiritual ambitions. This historical episode was commemorated in the tale of the Titan, Prometheus, who challenged the gods and brought fire from Mount Olympus down to man. Now Hellenic man rises above matriarchal body-centeredness and becomes aware of a higher calling and aspires to cosmic exaltation. He dares to become as the gods and struggles towards his own divinization, thus taking on the painful strivings of intellectual and spiritual advancement. Individualism, overriding of nature, and accumulating property and wealth as means to power were the byproducts of the Greeks' acquired Apollonian worldview. Logic, abstract thought, parental love that is conditional upon obedience, man-made laws, hierarchical structures, like corporations, and the warlike state are the inevitable consequences of patriarchal dominance. Why would the Brotherhoods want to introduce patriarchal concepts into the peaceful matriarchal world? Because a purely matriarchal society stands in the way of spiritual development of the individual and prevents technical, rational progress. The Brotherhoods undertook to challenge a complacent, stagnating world that was not fostering egoic balance anywhere. The Hebrews were enticed into Egypt by Joseph of the coat of many colors, son of Jacob, later called Israel. Joseph, by then a member of the Brotherhoods, brought his father's tribe out of the wilderness in order to educate them over 3 centuries and turn them into a patriarchal society under Moses. The Greek Gentiles and the Jews were the 2 agencies prepared for Melchizedek to spread the word of Christian thought. The Jews gave Western civilization the concepts of obedience to authority, personal sacrifice for a king or priest, male superiority, denial of the body, and shamefulness of sex, by which guilt and a sense of personal unworthiness are maintained in a culture in order to keep people submissive to authority. At the time of Christ, Greek philosophy supported these same concepts, except that a Greek might be ashamed to have a body for the reason that it demonstrated that he was still too base spiritually to do without one. The Minoan colonists carried the cause of patriarchy throughout the Mediterranean area, and the Romans learned it all too well from their Etruscan forebears. The legacy of masculine machismo plagues us to this day in Judaism, Christianity, and Mohammedanism. Surely the Brotherhoods saw the end results of all this, for it has been foretold in the Great Pyramid, in biblical prophecy, and especially in St. John's revelation of the end days just before the beginning of the nation of God and the Golden Age. The recent worldwide domination of patriarchal attitudes and Apollonian thought have given rise to wholesale industrial pollution, destructive rape of agricultural lands, power politics, the madness of war, economic enslavement, our individual inability to love, and pervasive sociopathic violence, all leading to the brink of Armageddon. Will man regain civilization and save himself? Yes. It's just that we seem to have to go to extremes before we become truly aware of the need for balance and moderation. The great plan of the Brotherhoods is calculated to lead us back to a condition where we will have the great advantages of technology and still preserve our oneness with the earth. The establishment of the nation of God, which the Stell Group is assigned to help bring about, will be guided by an enlightened synthesis between free and Catholic, practical and spiritual, Apollonian and Dionysian, patriarchal and matriarchal. Either outlook by itself leads to a dead end. Idealistic young people rebelled against our country's insane destruction of Vietnam and the arrogant policies of the establishment as it expresses through the industrial military complex and the national exploitiveness of the resources and peoples of the world. They dropped out of the main cultural stream to create alternative communities to demonstrate that Americans can live happily without engaging in conspicuous consumption of commodities, gouging their way up a corporate ladder, or contributing to overpopulation. They hope to show that man can live in complete harmony with the whole ecological system and can relearn how to enhance love of spouse, children, and people, rather than patriarchally owning and controlling them as things to serve him. In this they serve a valuable example in society. As is the danger of all reaction, the majority of such communes rejected technology as an evil of the establishment, and they drift towards matriarchal ways merely as a negation of patriarchal aggressiveness. However, this only leads back to the imbalance the Brotherhoods sought to undo 6,700 years ago. Of course, the manner in which various peoples adopted and responded to patriarchalism was their own doing, not the Brotherhoods. It took 66 centuries to fully develop the cultural characteristics of Western civilization needed to lead to the hoped-for balance, but then less than a century for technology to flower. Now that we have technology, we must hold on to it and bring it under control of humanistic values. Psychology can show us the way to understanding how we got into the patriarchal syndrome so deeply and how to find our way sanely to the balance that human beings so desperately need in order to provide for man's material and spiritual needs over the future millennia. A colony of only 144,000 men and women of the Brotherhoods, plus their children, is destined to preserve both technology and a balanced cosmic view for dissemination throughout the world after Armageddon. For this reason, STEL is dedicated to the sensible preservation and advancement of technology, while also educating its members in the ways of finding true fulfillment of their humanness. Thus they will better acquire the egoic balance needed for them to attain initiation in an imbalanced world. Are there any questions?
Can you think of some suggestions for ways in which a person can recognize an imbalance in himself, which side he leans to?
I think my comparison of Apollonian and Dionysian attitudes provides just about all the clues you would need to identify the mix of practical and idealistic traits within yourself. But perhaps the way in which you go about things requires balance. Are you able to discard the dogmas of scientific hypothesis and conventional religious beliefs? Open-mindedness and the willingness to look at possible advantages of a different set of values can be profitable. Another problem people often have is maintaining a balance of priorities between the demands of personal goals and group goals. Belonging to an organization which is involved in a worthy undertaking could be so engrossing as to cause you to lose sight of your personal ambitions. Conversely, being so preoccupied with your own needs could keep you from functioning usefully within the constraints and demands of a group. You must maintain balance between group endeavors and individual growth. The Brotherhoods seek the assistance of everyone who can hear and understand their plan for mankind's uplift, but they are also the first to remind you to subordinate your own growth to nothing. Fortunately, group and individual goals can be mutually reinforcing when kept in balance, and everyone in the group is dedicated to the advancement of individuals as the key to smooth forwarding of the group's ends. Still, another attitude which is useful to foster in yourself is tolerance of other people's unique ways of looking at their world. Everyone has a story and a refreshing outlook. One of the great problems of our society is its demand for conformance within very narrow bands of orthodox behavior and philosophy. Even the unrealistic, conflictual distinctions between labor and management are promulgated in everyday language and attitudes until the propaganda that these two classes of employees are at odds with one another has become an expectation upon which they operate. As a result, we all pay for the failure of each corporation's employees to pull together. It is important, you see, to consider the other person's side in order to have balance in your comprehension of the world and to keep clear channels open for input from different sources of information.
I heard at one point in your presentation that the Jews and the Minoans were originally aggressive people, chosen by the Brotherhoods to learn technology.
Yes, and how to become carpenters and stonemasons and to make workers out of them.
That was the intention.
Yes.
Do you know how an advanced ego would recognize balance in another ego? What devices would he use to know that you have reached the point where you are entitled to be an initiate?
The method that higher beings use has to do with their clairvoyant ability to perceive the development of an individual through his aura.
It seems that a good way to develop balance would be to involve yourself in those things which are opposite but complementary in a given area. So that, for instance, if you are involved in something artistic and you also have a job that is more along mechanical lines, then you should try to perceive the artistic aspects of the job that you do every day, while also getting to consciously understand the technical side of your artistic interests.
Well, that may be an oversimplification, but the idea is valid. One of the advantages of being in a STEL group is that we do point out how to better appreciate both sides of the practicality-ideality coin and to become aware of these differences in outlook. Most people have to go through life without ever having any of these broadening concepts pointed out to them.
It's easy to put things in boxes and label them Apollonian or Dionysian. When I look at a scientist like Einstein, I pick up a very Dionysian feeling about him. Yet he's famous for his very rational analyses. From the standpoint of balance, I think of things mechanical, rational, or scientific as associated with the Apollonian view. But apparently that's not necessarily the case.
Very true. It is not so much what class of things you are dealing with, but what you think about what you are doing that makes the difference. Your perception of the universe and how you mesh with it is really very interior to you. Some people have absolutely beautiful flights of fancy, which they have the skill of putting down as music, or they can use the plastic arts to convey their majestic and beautiful ideas and feelings to other people. Einstein put his magnificent flights of imagination into elegant mathematical formulae. That doesn't mean that because the majority of us have no technical discipline in those arts, that we don't have flights of fancy equal to those who are great composers, artists, or theoreticians. Those internal thrills are really ours, and it is we who own those experiences. Any kind of spiritual uplift is a rich thing for us to experience, and we can all enhance them. We should take the time to savor each such experience, which can border on the mystical. Even though you like to get home on time, it is valuable to pull your car over to the side of the road and fully absorb that sunset or contemplate a field of grain blowing in the wind.
I've been in conversations where members said that shortly after they arrived in STEL, it was uncanny how they were internally confronted with some of the problem areas in their own psychology. These may have been attitudinal hang-ups or unresolved neurotic tendencies of some kind that they brought with them. What I was wondering is, did they design these problems into this particular incarnation by those they chose as parents, so that they would be dissatisfied with society's shortcomings and come here to do something constructive about it?
I get the feeling that you have already decided that is so. I too believe that such dissatisfactions can lead to a person's coming to STEL. Someone who has money or physical attractiveness may just have everything fall into his lap and never feel the need to contemplate injustice or psychological pain. He fits into the world easily, and it seems perfect to him. The world will never require of him to have a worry or a philosophical thought cross his mind. But of course, there are very many mature people attracted to STEL because it provides a sensible medium for accomplishing great advances. When you have to struggle with the whys and wherefores of existence, it spurs you to try to find the answers. If you hadn't been seeking answers, you would never have been attracted to reading a book like The Ultimate Frontier. Fortunately, we do have solutions at STEL for attitudinal problems, and for finding balance, and techniques for effective living, and answers to mind-wringing questions about the nature of the universe. We have forewarned prospective members that the community of STEL is a meaningful social workshop, but they have been amazed at how quickly their masking and cover acts come unglued after arriving. They are forced to be honest with themselves and others here because of the openness and improved communication in the STEL community. So the newcomer feels his imbalances hit him all too keenly. But afterward, he too becomes a positive co-actor in getting things done and in personally growing positively. That some people spin out and leave STEL is inevitable. We recognize that in many cases we just cannot fulfill their images or dreams of what it was that they were going to find here. And yet even more people have found STEL far better than anything that they had imagined. I have certainly been told that hundreds of times. The fact that you find so many people who have been here for so long and are still getting a bigger and bigger kick out of it year by year says to me that we are moving in the right direction. This is a place where people are effectively doing something to help make the world what it should be. That is remarkably mature. We are growing and we feel alive. Here people have the opportunities to experience a great many things which they had never even thought about. Elsewhere, people try to make as few waves as possible and try to get by without having too many problems. A six-pack of beer while watching television every night is uncomplicated, but debilitating. You cannot avoid life or people here at STEL. whereas drugs and alcohol are used in the outside world to make up for one's lack of genuine involvement with others, or else to avoid life. Every human being has a tremendous drive to be sentient, to know, to be aware, to be alive fully. And yet our culture says that is too ambitious and fraught with possibilities of pain. Even a lion has to overcome the possibility of being severely injured or killed by his prey every time he hunts for his supper. But the gratifications of filling his belly are so much greater than getting a hoof in his ribs that he finds it worthwhile to keep on going out and filling his belly. Well, being alive in the fullest sense is such rich and heady stuff that we are willing to put up with the struggle of growing. The difficulties begin to diminish as you learn how to reach upward more effectively, and the rich stuff keeps getting better as you go forward. When some people at Stell look back after 3 or 4 years, they realize that they really don't have any pain in their lives anymore, and that they are truly happy. Their life is largely going the way that they want it to go, and most of the things that they really want to work for and accomplish, they are doing.
Then somebody gives you more responsibility.
You find that people like that seek responsibility because then they are the actors and the doers rather than being acted upon. Mature people want responsibility. Their lives are more exhilarating that way.
How did the words matriarchal and patriarchal take on the connotation of Dionysian and Apollonian?
Matriarchal cultures tend to take on the whole tapestry of characteristics typical of the Dionysian worldview. But matriarchal means matriarchal and not Dionysian. Otherwise there is no point in having different words.
My dictionary, for instance, says that matriarchal means a strictly female-run organization, civilization, or culture. But you have added all the connotations that go with the Catholic and the Dionysian concepts.
Maybe that is a point I should bring out. Some cultures, like the ancient Egyptian, were principally matriarchal, but the men were in charge of running things. The pharaohs were males, and men held title to property and conducted business in the government. But the cultural attitudes were Dionysian. About the only matriarchal thing conforming to the definition in your dictionary was that the ownership usually descended along the female line of heredity, and titles also transferred to the female side. But that was because in those days you could only be sure of your mother's side of the bloodline. However, private property was recognized in Egypt then, so it was Apollonian to that extent. What made Egypt matriarchal was the cultural attitudes that I have been talking about.
From the historical point of view of the period before the submergence of Atlantis, I remember reading somewhere that the Osirian civilization was supposed to have been in a great valley before it was flooded to form the Mediterranean Sea when Atlantis went down. The Egyptian civilization then later combined with the Osirian after its valley had been inundated.
You remember correctly. Egypt existed long before the Osirians immigrated from Atlantis. Its people go way back.
Was this Egypt along the Nile River or in the same valley as the Osirians before it was flooded to form the Mediterranean Sea?
Well, in both places. Most of the Osirian culture first settled north of modern Libya in the valley which later became the Mediterranean Sea. That valley was then below sea level, just like the Dead Sea is today. When Atlantis sank, the former barrier at the Straits of Gibraltar sank low enough to allow the Atlantic Ocean to pour into the Great Valley. This inundation took at least 1,000 years, so it occurred slowly enough that there was no loss of life from drowning.
When you speak of the mentality development of the ancient Egyptians, are you talking about the pre-Osirian Egyptian culture?
Yes, in the range of about 11,000 years ago. But it seems likely to me that both the Osirians and the Egyptians were lumped together by the Atlanteans and Ramans in their evaluations of the inhabitants of that part of the world then. The Osirians were already present as a strong influence in the western Mediterranean basin by that time, but they were not yet part of the Egyptian people. The Egyptians of that time had come from the east, whereas the Osirians came via Atlantis from the west. These two cultures later shared the Nile Valley following the flooding of the Mediterranean basin. The Osirians settled in the north, and the Egyptians occupied the south.
So this is a completely different Egypt than what our books of ancient history record.
Yeah, really quite a different cultural type. It was called Necropan in those ancient days.
Would you describe the early Egyptian culture for us?
It was almost wholly matriarchal and agrarian. Egypt was not warlike in any way in those days, nor did they have pharaohs yet.
Was the development of mentality a result of the priests?
No, it was the Osirians who developed mentality as a predominant trait, and the Egyptians picked it up from Osirian teachers. The unfortunate result of this was that after the destruction of the Osirian cities, these mental abilities were exploited by unscrupulous individuals who later gave rise to the black mentalists.
Did the mentalists become the Egyptian priesthood?
Right. The priesthoods came into complete domination centuries after the emergence of the Assyrians with the Egyptians along the Nile. Any more questions relating to balance? Very good, then. That concludes the session.
You have been listening to Balance, one in a series of discussions with Richard Kinninger entitled On Becoming an Initiate.